Good morning again, everybody. So thanks for joining today. Apologies for yesterday if you were one of those unfortunate people who joined but couldn't join. As luck would have it, the internet came back on literally 5 minutes before we were due to finish. So the only time it was out... oh, hang on. Let's turn this monitor down. Otherwise, we're going to hear me twice. Excuse me. Come on. There we go. Dear, frog in my throat. Yeah, so the only time the internet was out was in the exact period where the webinar was supposed to broadcast. So that's just the way it goes sometimes. All right, so I'll run through this quickly. If this is the first time you've joined us, then my name's David. I'm part of the software sales team based out of Copenhagen in Denmark. And as usual, we have 60 minutes allocated, and this kind of session we tend to use all of that. So you're in for the full 60-minute treatment today as well. It is being recorded. Ignore the interface if it says it's not being recorded. It always is, and I'll share it soon after this finishes, actually, or at some point today. You're very welcome to submit your questions at any time. And of course, most of you have found where the chat is, so do enjoy that. But it is public, so you will be able to hear. You will be able to see everything that everybody posts. So of course, please be nice to each other, which I'm sure you will. If you want to ask a question, there's quite a few of you here today because of the repeat from yesterday. So if you want to ask a question, you can either add your you can either add your chat message to Q&A, or probably even easier is just to go to the Q&A tab, and then you'll be able to ask a question directly. And then from time to time, I'll have a scan through and look them up. And then we've also got Andre, who's part of the Capture One team, lurking in the background as well, who can also help answering questions too. But if chatting or asking questions does not interest you, you can of course hide it by using the little down arrow up in the top right hand corner, and that will just minimize it, and then you should be fine. All right, so let us begin. So let's go to the screen, and then you should be able to see me on screen shortly, and we can get started. So I've tried to pick a sort of general selection of photos. The idea was not to practice them too much. Of course, we had a webinar session yesterday afternoon, so they have been practiced to some extent, but depending on the mood, I might not use the same ones. Let's see how we go. And there's also a variety of various different styles. We won't get through all of these, but I'll try and be a bit faster than yesterday. But don't worry if the photos here don't really fit your particular discipline or genre. I'm sure you can apply the techniques to anything, really. So try to consider it more as possible applications for your work. It's all sort of really very universal, with the exception of probably editing people, but we will have a look at a people shot as well. All right, let's... for the benefit of Rob in Canada, who's got up early, let's start with one from Canada from Renee Robin, one of our ambassadors. And this was shot off the coast of Newfoundland, I think, on a very chilly morning at about 6 a.m. So we often get asked the question, how should I start editing, or do I have to use the tools in any particular order? The answer is no. What I tend to do is get sort of a crop in place because I find it helps to visualize. And secondly, also fix exposure and white balance. But after that, really kind of the combination that you do things in is not super relevant. There's probably better, more streamlined ways to do it, which I hope you'll see today. But it's not critical in terms of finite output image quality. So first of all, to crop, as I said, crop tool up on our toolbar here, or C on your keyboard. Actually, let's just reset this. Make sure it's straight out of the camera. It is, good. So crop tool up on the cursor toolbar here. So let's just throw in a crop. Now that's locked to square right now from an earlier session. So let's right click and change that to unconstrained. So now I've got the freedom of cropping. Whoops, except let's just start again. Obviously not enough coffee this morning. So let's just crop this like so. Now, incidentally, there is an update to Capture One that came out yesterday. So depending on your version, you may or may not have this new grid tool, which is super handy because that allows you to change the sort of grid overlay that you see in inside the crop window in a nice speedy way without actually having to go into the preferences. So let's get our crop. Now you can either hit H on your keyboard, tap, and then that will just expand out to fit the image into the screen quite nicely. Also, when I'm editing, I like to turn this on, this little proof view. This just gives me a bit more space around the outside. I just find it a little bit easier to visualize for some strange reason. So crop in place. First or second tool tab rather, we can think about exposure and fixing the white balance. Now this is pretty good out of camera. If anything, it's maybe a little bit too dark. So I just lift that ever so slightly to around there. And also on my levels tool, it's very important that you don't forget about the levels. This is probably something that is always in my sort of mind when I'm first starting. And you've got two choices. You can hit auto, nice and easy, and that just sets the shadow and highlight points just to bring those in. And that just avoids starting with, you know, a flat sort of kind of fluffy image, if you like, or too low contrast. And from that point on, then we can start to build contrast, clarity, color changes, all that kind of stuff. But this is now a good start point. I might just warm this up a touch, as this was shot early morning, and then I get the impression that there's, or you can see that there's a nice bit of light bouncing off the tail. So that's something we can enhance a bit later as well. So first of all, a tiny bit of contrast will do, and then clarity as well, which will be a big help for this shot, I think. And clarity, as I've explained before, is similar to a contrast control, but it's avoiding the shadows and the highlights. So therefore the contrast boost just comes in the mid-tone. So your blacks, like on the whale tail here, don't get all blocky and nasty, and we don't lose highlight detail as well. So to see what the clarity is just doing, if we long click on the clarity name here, we can see before and after, like so. Nice little mid-tone pop. On the tail, let's just bring some of those highlights back. And now we're at a good start point to kind of do a few more interesting things. Now, if we look at this guy close up, you can see there's just a tiny bit of movement. I imagine this guy wasn't hanging around, so it's hard to capture that. Or freeze it if you like. Probably it wasn't that bright in the morning. Let's have a look at our viewer labels. So I know it's a 1/2500th of a second. Wow, so he must have been moving quick. So Rene did a good job to catch that. Let's hide those labels again. But it'd be nice to sharpen up some of these bumps and scratches. This guy has obviously had a hard life. So one thing that we can do is, I'm just going to go to 200% so you can really see, is bump up the structure, especially here as it's not moving. We can get, you know, a nice impression of all the hard life this guy has had. But by increasing that structure, you can start to see that we're getting some of that noise enhanced as well, which kind of we don't want to see. Now in my editing, this is where I start to distill things down into what works best as potentially a local edit. And this doesn't mean it's going to slow you down. It's very fast to work in layers, and it will give you a better result at the end of it. So this structure value here works well for the tail and probably down here to some extent, but it's not great for the sea and it's not great for the sky. So let's reset that, double click, and think about doing this locally. Now, if you haven't used layers before, this might seem a little bit too much, but there's great tutorials on our Learning Hub, of course, to get you started with using layers. But it's a simple premise. You draw a layer using some kind of method, and you'll see a few today. And then on that layer, of course, those edits only action upon that layer. And then you have additional flexibility, being able to change the opacity of that layer to moderate, you know, how strong your correction is. So very simply on this one, if I make a new layer, and let's call this whale tail, sounds good. Grab a brush, so that's this icon here. And then when we move on to our picture, we get a slightly different icon of these two circles. Now it looks a bit funny on the webinar transmission, just to warn you, you're going to see 3 circles probably. It's just because the broadcast software makes the cursor a bit bigger, so it's easier to see, but it makes this cursor looks a bit funny. But when you look at it, you're going to have an inner circle and an outer circle, and that just shows you from the inner to outer the roll off from maximum opacity to the edge, so how soft the brush is. So just be aware of that when you're editing. So if I right click, I'm going to make this a bit smaller. Sorry, I'm actually going to zoom in a little bit. And then what I'm going to do is just do a really sort of quick and dirty mask on the tail. Now M on your keyboard will show the mask in red. So then I'm just going to brush sort of around here. I'm not going to be particularly accurate about it. Doesn't need to be. Someone asked yesterday, well, why don't we auto mask like super accurately around the fin? Because it's not really worth it, to be honest. And then also sometimes the more accurate masks you make, the more obvious it is that you've done some kind of masking. So that's just a quick simple mask on the tail like so. And then what we're going to do on this layer, whale tail, is then just add our structure. So let's just bring this out. We're just going to add the structure back just into that section, and thereby we're going to avoid, you know, making our sky noisy and all that kind of stuff. So let's pop that back away. While we're zoomed in, we can see that we've got some kind of dust spot or blurry seagull or something. So in our spot removal tool, I'm going to make sure this is set to spot. So spot means it's an object on the actual photo, like a spot on someone's face or a blemish or something like that. Dust means that it's dust that's stuck on your camera sensor. So it's just a different method of removal. So we can grab the outer edge of the circle and just get rid of that guy, like so. So that's a pretty good start. If we turn off the structure layer, sorry, the whale tail layer, then if we turn that off, then you can see before, so it's a little bit kind of blurry there and after. We could probably even be brave and add in some bit of extra sharpening as well. Why not? Especially if we were going to print this, it would just show up better. But now it's actually, I might regret that decision because we don't want it to get that noise there. But what we could do is if I press E for eraser, then we can just get rid of that bit like so. And then now it doesn't look noisy and nasty. Cool. All right. Almost done. I'm going to go back to the background, go to the color editor, because I know there's a little bit of sun bouncing off that tail. So it'd be nice if we could enhance that. So I tend to favor the advanced tab. Purely because it gives you a bit more control, and I actually think it's faster to use than basic. The only thing you have to bear in mind for advanced is that we need to grab our picker and then tell Capture One what we want to edit. So if I click here, I'm willing to bet we get somewhere in the warm tones, like so, which is true. Just to make sure we capture everything, I'm going to expand that out, and then we can increase the saturation. If I go really crazy, you can see exactly what it's doing, and in the other direction, like so. So I'm just going to give that a bit of a boost, probably something not that much so it looks fake, but just to give an impression that it's a little bit warmer than it is. So let's settle on something around that. So if I turn this off, then you can see before and after. So it's subtle, but just helps to enhance, I think. Now the last thing that we want to do is just want to open up the shadows a little bit here along the side of the tail, because there's some nice detail going on there that we can see, but it's just, you know, 10% too dark or whatever. Now what we could do is just lift up our shadow slider, high dynamic range, and if we do that, then of course it's changing the sea as well, and that's now it's looking flat and uninteresting. So of course what we want to do is put this on a layer instead. So if we go back to our layers tool, I'm going to do a slightly different one here, is start with a new filled layer. And the reason for that, and I learnt this from a Photoshop expert, so I can't take the credit, is that by starting with a filled layer, so if I press M on my keyboard, you can now see that we've essentially made a quick layer over the entire shot. So anything I do now is going to affect the whole image. Now I just said I didn't want to do that, but this allows me to dial in the amount of adjustment that I want to have. So right now all I'm going to do is look at the tail. I'm not worried about anything else, and set this to where I think it's going to be good. So I'm going to say probably around there, but I'm thinking that's too much. And then back on my layer, let's say whale. What's the correct anatomical term for that bit of the whale? Whale, I'm going to say spine, for want of a better, it's probably tail part 2. So now what I'm going to do is right click and say clear mask, and that will get rid of the mask, but it will still keep my underlying adjustment. And now we can brush that back in to the right amount. So if I grab brush, oh, it's the tail fluke. Thanks, Tammy. Resident whale expert. So now what I can do is just brush that back in where I want to have it. Now before, we had our flow set to 100, which simply means when you make a pass of the pen or mouse, it'll draw that entire adjustment, whatever my shadow lift was, in one hit. Now we want to be able to build it up and then hit the brakes when we know it's kind of looking good. So if we turn our flow down like so, then to 5, then that means every brush stroke, whether it's pen or mouse, makes no difference, especially if you keep the button held down on the mouse. It'll lay down 5%. So 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30. So we can then accurately brush in where we want to. So if I grab a slightly larger brush, and then I can just brush back and forth, and then gradually that's gonna brighten that area. Could do a little bit here, and then when I think I'm happy with it, I can stop. Now if I think I've overcooked it too much, then we've also got the opacity slider here as well, so I can just dial that back a bit until I think it looks good. So if we turn that off, whale fluke, then you can see how it looks there. And then if we turn it back on, then it'll just take a minute to update. You can see how it looks now. So just subtle but nice. And if we turn our whale tail off, then we can see what the structure is doing too. So it's quite enough for this guy, I think. Let's make a virtual copy. So we do a new variant, so we can see how it came out of camera, and let's just Apple click to put those two side by side. Let's hide our browser, hide our tools, and then you can see the difference like so. So let's zoom. So if I hold my shift key down and click on the plus button, then it will go to 100% like so. All right, so I'm going to leave that up, and then let's look at the questions. Alan said, sorry, I just caught that, it looked more like sensor dust. I don't know, I think it's hard to tell actually, it could be. It's just it looked a bit too jagged on the edges. For normally sensor dust is a perfect circle, which led me to believe it was something out of focus. But essentially the correction algorithm spot just works differently because it's assuming it's something on the object itself, like a mark here on the fin, spot on someone's face, dirt on the ground or whatever. Dust, the math algorithm is based on sensor dust, so it's a bit different. But if one doesn't work, try the other one. But that actually did a pretty good job of getting rid of that dust spot around here somewhere, so I'm happy with what that did. Okay, so if I look at the questions, Philip says, when you do any raw processing under Capture One, do you work in a room lit with a daylight lamp and on a calibrated monitor? So yes, when I do the webinar, it's on a MacBook Pro screen, which is calibrated, but it's probably not the bestest screen ever. Normal daily life is looking this direction, which is on a ISO monitor which self calibrates every day, which is fantastic. I used to have a monitor where I had to stick a calibration device on it. In reality, did I ever bother to do that as regularly as I should? No. So the great advantage of having the ISO is that as soon as it turns on in the morning when the office powers up, the little calibration thing pops up and it does its thing. So this ISO is bang on every single day, which is brilliant. I know it's expensive and it's way out of budget for a lot of us. This was a kind loaner from ISO, so I'm very fortunate. But it really does make a difference to know that you're always looking at something that looks spot on. But if you do have a calibration device, which doesn't cost a lot, then of course every 6 weeks or so, you can slap that on your monitor and away you go. I read an interesting thread this week where someone said there's no point calibrating your monitor because no one else does in the real world. Kind of disagree with that, because you should have a good starting point at least, and then there's a better chance it's going to look great on everyone else's screen. Why do we correct wildlife that does not need cosmetics, as nature has its beauty there? I agree, so I wouldn't get rid of any of this stuff on the fin. We actually enhance that. This all looks fantastic. He's obviously he or she has had a hard life, and it's nice to showcase that. So I'd never retouch any of that stuff, but the enhancements, if you like, is the sun bouncing off this, making it sharper so we can see all of that good stuff. Alrighty, let's just have a check and then we can move on to someone else. Which ISO is it? That is a good point. Shall we have a look? 1 second. CG277. So it's an older one. It's not 4K or whatever, but I think that's fine. I think 4K would do my eyesight in, to be honest. So it's 2K, I guess. But I think it's a really great display, that's for sure. Alrighty, let's do another one. So let's bring back the browser. Come on, B. Bring back the tools. I'm going to hide my viewer, by the way, to easily see like a grid mode. Just hide your viewer. You can set a shortcut key. Mine is the one under the escape key. So boom, away goes the viewer. Let's do, we didn't do any people yesterday. So I put this photo in, but kind of doesn't need much correction at all really, but we could do something with the skin tones, which is kind of what we missed out yesterday as well. Alright, so starting point, it's pretty fantastic out of camera, to be honest. What I will do is maybe brighten just a teeny tiny bit, and then A for auto, slightly better contrast. Let's throw in a bit more contrast as well. Clarity, I'm a bit more apprehensive with people. If I just go too much, then I think it's maybe not the most flattering adjustment that one can give, but just a few more points. And her hair's going a bit dark here, so let's just open up the shadows ever so slightly. Now if we're in a hurry, we could almost stop there. I've got a feeling this is on an A7R, so it's blindingly sharp, of course. What are we on? An A7R Mark III. Anyone who's lucky enough to have an A7R Mark IV in their sweaty paws, we had a new release yesterday which supports that. So if you do have an A7R4, make sure you update. Also for this, I might actually be tempted to turn the sharpening down a bit because it's not really necessary to be that sharp. So I think I'd just take the edge off that slightly. Now when it comes to spotting, her skin is great, but if you did need to spot on skin, then you should have the spot turned on, and then for example this minuscule spot here, if we wanted to remove that, then I would use the spot tool, for example. Now what we can do on this shot is use wonderful skin tone correction. So there's, I mean, she has amazing skin, but there's, of course, like all of us, a very slight variation of skin tone. And sometimes, especially if there's like other body parts in play, like hands on faces, the difference can be dramatic, especially if they're cold. And also we can see, just like on a shoulder blades or whatever, then the skin tone varies, and sometimes it's nice to be able to even it out to some extent quickly and easily. So what we can do is use our skin tone tool, or sorry, the skin tone tab in the advanced color editor, I should say. Oh, let's reset this one. So let's make this a little bit bigger. And the skin tone tab is kind of similar to the advanced tab, except it has an additional bank of sliders called uniformity. And what those do is kind of try to look at a range of colors and make them all the same. That's probably the easiest way to explain it. So when I say range of colors, if you look at my skin tone, for example, you know, it's different here, 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 especially here. So if we can sort of analyze that and then say make it all the same, or at least draw them closer together, then you can even up the skin tone. So that's really what the skin tone tool is doing. So how we use this is to start with the color picker, and then you pick on your desirable skin tone. So I'm going to go somewhere around here like that, and that shows me, you know, a suggested color range selection. Now I'm just going to make this a little bit larger to make sure that we're capturing every skin tone on our face. And then we've got the same sliders here for changing hue, saturation and lightness, but they have a much narrower range. So if I pull lightness, for example, see, it's very subtle, which is how it's designed, because it's just for minor changes to skin tone. It's not going to give you the full-on orange filtered Instagram look or whatever. Now if I drag hue all the way to the right, what's going to happen is everything in that triangle will get transformed to this spot, which was the point that I picked. So if we did drag hue all the way to the right, you can see now that it's normalized all of her skin. But the unwanted side effect, of course, is that it's changed the color of her lips, which we don't want. So if we bring that back out, then you can see the difference. So what we need to do, of course, is do this on a layer. Now we've got two options. We can draw a mask on her face and then do exactly the same thing. But that's kind of like the whale fluke, thanks Tammy, is that it's an all or nothing correction. So I'm going to show you a different method. So let's reset that. And let's just collapse color editor. In our layers tool, we're going to make a new filled layer once again, and we're going to call this skin tone. And we're going to do the same as before. So remember, this is now on her whole face, so this is just going to let us dial the correction in. So let's pick our desirable skin tone. So I'm going to go around there. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger just to make sure we capture everything. And then I'm going to go correct the hue and stop when I think it's about right. And I'm mostly concerned with the bridge of the nose here. And we're kind of bring up lightness a little bit as well, but not too much. And also saturation. So now we've got, if you like, the max correction that we might possibly want to do. So now I'm going to right click and clear that mask. Boom. Like you can see, and now we can brush this in where we think we need it. So now we've essentially made ourselves a skin tone correction brush, which we can put anywhere. Now we could keep flow to 100 and then just brush where we want, or we could keep it lower. Let's go up a little bit, and then if I make this a bit bigger, we can now just apply our skin tone correction. Now it's probably going to be super subtle, which is what we're looking for, but then we can go anywhere and just brush. We can avoid her lips. We could probably go down to, if we were bothered, I probably wouldn't, but we could essentially do a skin tone correction here as well, and sort of down here. And I'm brushing in a pretty low opacity, so it's going to be a subtle change, and we probably won't really see much until we turn the layer on and off, but we could do a little bit down here and so on. So you get the idea. Now if we turn our layer off, where is she? So if we turn off, let's go to a bit more of a zoom, and then we say skin tone off. So you see our nose change, skin tone on, like so. Now if again that's too much, we can moderate that with the opacity and sort of blend it in until we get the right nuanced amount. Now that's super easy for me to do and for you. Much harder to do that in Photoshop because you need to know a bit about color correction and mixing colors and all that sort of stuff, which I'm not that super skilled on, but obviously high-end retouching is. But imagine if you've got 10 shots to do, it's going to be much quicker in Capture One to do a quick skin tone edit like that, rather than having to bounce into Photoshop, do complicated stuff, and then come back to Capture One for export and so on. So doing that method creates your skin tone correction tool, if you like, which is super, super handy. So I might just throw in a little vignette like so. Say we didn't do a lot to this shot at all. To see your before and after, let's just put our color editor away. Another method, hold your Alt key down, click on the reset button up here, and then that will show before and after. So not really a huge amount different. Let's also make a virtual copy. So let's make a new variant. Let's bring them up side by side, and let's zoom into, if I shift click the plus in the top right, then that will take us both to 100%. Now if we were going full on retouch, obviously we'd round trip to Photoshop, do some retouching, all that kind of stuff. I don't think she needs it personally, but obviously Capture One is not a retouching app, so for those things you need to go out into Photoshop. But Skin Tool is just so easy to make those minor corrections. Oh, we did a bit down here. Let's see if it did make a difference. If we turn off skin tone, yeah, very super subtle, as you can see there as well. All right, let's have a look at questions. Let's see. How would you remove noise from skin, a shot taken in low light? Well, Gary, what you could do, obviously every image that you load into Capture One has a default noise reduction. If it needs more, don't forget noise reduction you can do on a layer as well. So you could do additional noise reduction on skin if you want to as well. Or you can sort of embrace it if you like. You could always add a bit of grain as a way to hide noise. That sounds crazy, but you know, if it is a bit noisy, then often film grain can, you know, give you a different result if you're not going for that. So she's probably going to look really nice with a bit of film grain as well. So yeah, there we go. But yeah, you could mask in some extra noise reduction where it's necessary, because in some areas it's not necessary. Like with the whale, for example, we could have sharpened everything and then done more noise reduction on everything else, but that's sort of fighting against two different things. Whereas if you wanted to do more noise reduction on the skin, I would just do it on a layer, for example. Yes, Denise, you answered your own question there. I can tell you, I can see that. Let's have a look at the questions. Q&A. So, does it make a difference if I do color correction after exporting to Photoshop, doing some stuff there and importing to C1 again? Good question. Like obviously the raw file, you have the biggest scope, but if we sort of exported this to Photoshop and came back and wanted to, you know, color grade with a color balance tool, then I don't see any issue with doing that. There's enough meat in the file to do so. I think if you were doing a lot of color correction, the most you can do in Capture One would certainly help because you have all the raw data, especially skin tone correction. I don't think the skin tone tab would work as well on a, you know, an exported file compared to the raw file. That's at least my hunch, but a 16-bit TIFF or PSD probably still work okay, but try and do as much as possible. Can you de-blemish skin? I saw Laura asking. Not really. I mean, you can do some spotting, but blemishes, then that's really a job for Photoshop, I would say. You can try and do negative clarity, but it's a bit of a hack, if you like. So if we did negative clarity, then you can soften the skin. Oh, let's just reset. So look, if we did negative clarity, you see it softens it, but you want to do that on a mask where it is in place. But it's kind of a bit of a hack, if you know what I mean. But sometimes it can be okay. Let's go put our grain back on, because I think that looked, maybe not that much, looked quite nice. But yeah, negative clarity, maybe. Do I edit differently if I'm going to print the image? Not really, and I think that's down to finding a good printer. There was a great printer in the UK called L-Type. That was the kind of print they did. And I have to say, what I saw on my screen was bang on what I got back in the box. So, and that was just, obviously they have their, or had sadly, their calibration down pat, as we spoke about with the monitor. It was well calibrated, so I didn't have any sort of issue. Now when I've done, you know, canvas prints of the kids or whatever, it's, you know, it's not quite as good. So more often than not, prints can come out a bit darker because you're used to looking at transmitted light as opposed to reflective, so you lose a bit of that. But you know, a good calibrated system, it should come out pretty spot on, to be honest. All right, how are we doing for time? God, I'm slow today. So the difference between sharpen and clarity. Well, clarity is just the clarity slider is a contrast boost only in the midtones, nothing to do with sharpening, but it can kind of make stuff look sharper in terms of less hazy. The structure slider is more about enhancing fine details like architectural details, whale fins, animal fur, landscape details, and so on. So it's really good for that edge definition, whereas sharpness is probably a little bit more subtle. If you push structure too far, it can get nasty pretty quick, whereas sharpening, you can push quite hard and everything will get sharper as such, but with less negative results. Okay, let's move on to another photo before we run out of time. Okay, so let's pop film grain back to whence it belongs, and let's do a speedy one, which is also quite fun because it's a good little back and forth. Let's go to Roosevelt Island. Let's hide my browser. So first of all, cropping. So C for crop on your keyboard. And I'm gonna, it looks a bit bottom heavy for want of a better word. So let's get rid of some of the water. And this again is pretty good out of camera. Looking at the histogram, looks kind of relatively nice and even. I might warm it up ever so slightly, and let's bump up the exposure just a touch, and then hit auto on my levels, and that's a good start point. Now we could stop there if we wanted to, but if we look inside our cable car, we've got all these kind of nice faces, but they're a little bit dark. So first instinct was to open up the shadows, which we can do that, and we can see that has a good positive effect on our people in the carriage, but it's going to make the rest of the image starting to have that nasty HDR look. So no surprises for guessing. We might be able to get away with just doing a quick mask here. Nah, let's not actually. Let's just do it properly with a filled layer, and then look at our faces in the carriage, and let's just see where we think that's good. So I'm going to overcook that a bit more, and once again go back and clear our mask, so we've still got our adjustment. Grab our brush, and in this case a nice low flow, and then we can just peek into the windows and then open these up. Now you could say, well, why not do an exposure correction? But the nice thing about the shadow correction is that it's only going to target the darker areas. So this sort of bit when we see through the window will be less changed. If we'd done exposure, this would all be getting a bit bright and a bit nasty. So now we can just draw in the windows like so, and do so. Now there's a cool trick we can do with this, and if I paint over Roosevelt Island the letters, they're not going to change because that's a highlight. If it was a brightness adjustment or an exposure adjustment, then it was going to affect that as well. So I think that's pretty good. If we turn off our layer 1, then you can see before and after, like so. Now it's made the red a bit wishy-washy in places. So on the same layer, we could just pick our red in our color editor. So this red, and just darken it down a little bit, not that much. Probably around, just so it kind of matches the rest of the cabin, just to sort of counteract what we did to some extent. Because that red, if we hover the cursor over there, let's look at our levels. If we stick the cursor there, you see it's just that orange line. I'm trying to point to it on my screen like an idiot. So this orange line here, that's showing me that tone. Now the shadow correction will affect that slightly, so we can just counteract what we did with the color editor. So now when we turn this layer on and off, we're mostly affecting the people in the carriage without affecting the red around the outside the carriage, for example. So that's, you know, just good little sort of handy, neat trick. And as I said, if we'd used exposure or something, like if we bump up the exposure, it's kind of affecting everything, which doesn't look quite as slick as doing that shadow bump. Now for that shot, that's probably all we're going to do. Let's go and drop vignetting down a tiny bit, and away we go. Alt key down and click. So that was before and after. So not much change, but just now we can see a bit more what's going on in there, and I think that just works quite nicely. So not every edit has to be 15 minutes long, David, so we can have shorter ones as well. Yes, Simon, L-Type did close down, sadly. I think they were too cheap, essentially. They could have charged a lot more for their, frankly, fantastic prints, but sadly, that's the way it goes sometimes. Could we look at a round trip to Photoshop? Yeah, we can do one very quickly on the next shot, I think. Does it? Udi, we answered, so that's fine. Can you set a new filled layer to be the default? Laura said no, but what you can do, if you go to Edit Keyboard Shortcuts, type in layer, I think, and you can see you can add shortcuts for various different layer types, which is generally what I do. So I wouldn't personally always use the plus button, but if I use shortcut keys, then you guys can't see what on earth is going on. So hence using the mouse more in a webinar than I would in real life, if you like. So you could set yourself a add new field adjustment layer key. What could that be? So we could do Shift Command, let's see, L or something like that. So let's close that down. Now if I do Shift Command L, I get a new filled layer, like so. So that's the fastest way to do it. If I press M, now you can see it like so. Right, let's go to another shot. Now this one, we sort of did an accidental edit to it yesterday because we had a question about luminosity masking. And also looking at masks in grayscale as well, and we did this sort of quick and dirty edit on this one, and it actually worked really nicely on this shot without trying too hard. So what is luma masking? That's creating a mask based on the density of the tones in the image. So in this case, let's just make sure we're reset. So this is how this one's come out of camera. So Laura, we do a new filled layer, Shift Command L. How fast was that? And now, if we want to look at the mask in grayscale, then we can do Option M or Alt M. And now the image is going to turn white because as opposed to seeing the mask overlaid in red, you're now going to see a grayscale mask where white means the area is fully masked and black means it's not masked. And then you can have anywhere in between as well. So right now we have a layered mask, and we can say to Capture One, let's put a constraint on this mask based on the tones on the image. So if we hit Luma Range, we get the Luma range dialog up, which essentially shows you from 0 to 255 and some roll off as well. So let's say we only want to look at the shadows in this photo. Then I would bring the range down, and it will take a little while to calculate. And now we can see we've pretty much only got the shadows in this shot, like so. So remember, white is masked, black is not masked. If we bring this down, then we get even more of the shadow areas, like so. So we can probably just sneak this up a little bit. So the idea of having some fall off is that you don't get a super hard edge when you slip from one tone to another. Now, underneath here, you have two very powerful sliders, radius and sensitivity. So when radius at 0, sensitivity does nothing. So this is kind of how default masks are built. Now, as you increase the radius, let's push it quite high, this now means sensitivity can do something. And what this sensitivity slider is a bias. So right now it's kind of sat in the middle. So we have a compromise between the two either ends of the scale. So if I go to 0 on sensitivity and we let the mask update, you can see it's feathered. So it has very soft edges, which is good for like skin tone selections, which you can use this for. Anything where you don't want the mask to be very obvious. Now, if we go in the opposite direction to 100, this essentially means refine the mask, so fit to the edges. So it'll hug all the edges quite dramatically, as you can see. So on this shot, I'd probably just back that off a little bit so it has some kind of, edge softness, and say apply. So now we've built a very specific mask, which you can never draw by hand, just on the shadow areas. So the white areas are what we've masked. So if we press M to come out of that, and then we go to exposure, for example, and we can lift that, and it actually has a really nice sort of brightening effect, but it hasn't messed up the rest of our photo, which is great. So we sort of accidentally did that yesterday. Now, before I would have done that, what I'd normally do, if we just go to the background, I'd probably raise the whole image a little bit, and then let's just say A for auto levels. We've got some nice cloud highlights, so I'd bring them back just a touch, and then to just lift the bottom area a bit, then we can go to our luminosity layer, so let's call that shadows, and it's a Luma mask because it has the sunshine icon, and then we can just lift those up a bit as well. Actually work surprisingly nicely in this. So that gives us another way to balance exposure in the shot. We've still got our highlights, we've lifted up these darker areas a little bit. If I wanted to, in the background, I could open up the shadows a bit more, but kind of I don't want to do that much because this is a good tone. I feel I might want to peek into the cave a little bit more. Now this guy, he's the star of the show. Let's just add some clarity in general. Now this image, I think, because it's quality wise, it looks pretty super sharp. What camera was it? Sony, once again, A7R Mark III. Stellar camera. I think we can safely add structure to everything because there's very little noise. Like even if we look in the cave, I mean the black is clean as anything, so I'm happy to add structure without fear of messing up anything else. So the better quality the start point, the more structure you can push in before it starts to look nasty. So we can safely add quite a lot of structure there. Now, as I said, this guy is the star of the show. So a very quick thing we could do, let's pick out his space jacket, whatever it is. And then I'm going to make this a bit brighter so he stands out and a bit more saturated, like so. So he's glowing nicely in the background. Now, if we wanted to open up the shadow area a bit more, we could do the same trick with the whale fluke and just paint in a tiny bit of shadow improvement in there, but it actually looks, we can just see in, so we know there's a monster hiding in there or something, but it's not too black in the dark. Whoever it was, Stefan, I think, the quick before and after, Alt key on your keyboard, and then click on the reset button, and then that's before and after. Now I think, funny, we spend loads of money on lenses that don't vignette, and then I ruin it by always putting a vignette on everything. So Alt, so before and after, like so. So that's a really good use case, as the nerdy word we use it for, luminosity masking for sure. Okay, so let's see. Yeah, and that's another good layer shortcut, custom shortcut to get back to the background. So you've got the ability to pick which layer you're on here, or edit keyboard shortcuts. If we type in layer again, select, whoops, click the wrong thing, select background layer. So let's do Tammy's Command B. Oh, that's already show hide browser. What can we do? Run out of keys. Let's do Shift Command B. That's already in use. Hide mode. Damn it. Control Command B. How about that? There we go. Finally. Control Command B. So that takes me, if I'm on anywhere, doesn't matter which tool tab I'm in, Control Command B in this case takes me straight to my background layer. So I think, who was it asking? I can't remember about the layers. That was, you know who you are, but as well as doing the, Laura, as well as doing the new filled layer, go to background, all those different heel types, and so on and so forth. Okay, how are we doing for time? Good. We can do another one and throw in Photoshop for the last little bit. So what shall we do where we could possibly need Photoshop? Probably that one actually. Well, I'll show you quickly how to do round trip on this one. So all we need to do is right click and say edit with, not open. Edit with is important distinction. When you say edit with, you always get an additional file created. So let's say we want to have our PSD file in whatever color space and whatever size. So we're just going to go max out, and we say edit variants like so. So Capture One will process when it's done in a second. So now you can see the PSD file there, and then it's going to open up in Photoshop. Let's just put the PSD up. So there's my PSD, and then you're going to see some legendarily bad retouching from me. Hang on, Photoshop's on the other screen. So let's open this up. So I'm going to make a new layer. Let's call this whatever, retouch. And then we can go in and do our retouching. Oh, we still had our grain on, that's fine. But if we wanted to retouch, let's do some whatever, not that she needs it once again. But if we wanted to do some basic retouching or get rid of a hair strand, like so, I said it was going to be bad. But let's pretend we're doing this properly and with skill. So we'd finish our retouch and so on. Then we close down our Photoshop file. Yes, we want to save. Yes, max compatibility should be on. And then as soon as we go back to Capture One, you'll see the progress bar pop up here. And now we can see our new preview, like so. But the cool thing is we've still got that layer. So now I can see I made a complete disaster of that retouching. So I can right click and now say open with, because that's just going to open the file. It's not going to make an additional one. So we can go back into Photoshop, go to my terrible retouching layer, for example. Let's just turn off the background, get rid of this awful, well, that's Photoshop. That's great. You weren't staying with erase this terrible retouching. Wow, Photoshop is running super slow. I find this of late. I don't know what's happening to my Photoshop, but it's kind of crawling to a halt sometimes. There we go. So let's get rid of some of that terrible retouching. Close this down, save, come back, and then you'll see that's going to disappear when the preview is rebuilt, which is about now. There we go. like so. Now the cool thing is you can actually make variants. So if we make a virtual copy of my PSD file, we could then say, well, let's have a black and white version, for example, like so. So yeah, you can still edit on a PSD file kind of like you do with raw files, but just bear in mind the scope of edits are going to be a little bit more sort of compressed than it's possible with the raw file. Okay, let's go and do something else. We did landscape, we did that, we did let's look at this one, because this is fast, but it shows how to use clone and heal layers. So let's reset that is. Once again, crop wise, the only thing I might do is just crop a bit off the bottom, like so. Exposure wise, it's a bit dark, so let's pull that up, and A for auto once more. The middle handle, this will change our mid-tone density, so we might give a bit more guts to that, and we can probably get away with a fair amount of clarity. Now the water, blurry water, is a bit on the bluey side, and we're probably just losing some highlight detail there, so let's bring some of that back. Now what we could do, I think we can probably get away with just warming the whole shot up a touch, but sometimes if the water looks too blue, you can do a mask, don't need to do it here, and then do a different white balance. So don't forget, white balance can work on different masks as well. Now one thing is we've got, I don't know, looks like a piece of litter, I suppose, stuck to this rock. It's kind of distracting. So what we can do for a different heal type is, layer type, is a new heal layer or a clone layer. So clone is just a like for like copy. Heal will help to blend the luminosity better so it's less obvious. So what we need to do is grab our brush, and the cursor looks slightly different. So it's got those little arrows around the outside. So let's make this a bit smaller. So what I want to do is I want to kind of copy a bit of this rock and stick it on that rock. Now Capture One can try and guess a source point, but it invariably gets it wrong. So if you hold your Alt key down, then you'll see the cursor is just across. So we can say, I want to pick kind of this area here. So we get a dot. And then now I'm going to just mask on this section, like so. I think I have my flow up to the max. Yep. Oh, I don't want pen pressure. So let's just make sure that's covered. Let's hide my mask and get rid of the brush. And then now it'll help to do that. Now, if you think actually that doesn't look that great, we can pick up our source point and then we can try a different spot. So let's go for this one, or down to the right a bit, and you can move around the image and find a good spot. I think probably just to, I forgot my crop cursor tool up. Whoops, come here, Capture One. So that's better. I had to zoom in. I thought, why can't I see my bottom? I think I'm going to use a bit of its own rock. I can probably just about get away. There we go. That's probably a better density and tone. And then now it matches quite nicely. So let's bring the crop back to where it should be, probably around something like that. So if we turn that off, then you can see before and after, like so. So I wouldn't call that retouching, but if you've just got a quick blemish which is bigger than what the spot tool can cope with, then that's a good way to use it as well. So before and after, if we hold down our Alt key, Alt, and say before, that's out of camera, and then just with some basic edits. Can you change the luminosity of the spot? No, you'll see that all the tools are grayed out. But if we were to change like a global change, so if I mess with the exposure now, you see it automatically compensates for that spot. So here we'll try to do a luminosity blend automatically, as you can see. If we change this to a clone, So if I switch this to a clone layer, then you see it looks a little bit darker because it's just done a like for like copy, where here we'll try and match luminosity. Now I don't know if, let's just try something. Copy mask from, okay, so on this repair layer, this is our mask. So in red, shown in red or grayscale, that's our mask. So what you could do is, if you make a new layer and right click and say copy mask from repair layer, so that's giving us the same shape mask. So now if I wanted to change the luminosity, so I can make it brighter or darker or more saturated, then you could also play around with blending it a little better as well. Generally you don't need to, so it normally does a good job, but in those cases you could just copy the mask and then you could do any of the other sort of stuff as well available in Capture One. All right, sadly I think we are pretty much out of time, so I don't know how many shots did we get through. We did this one, we did that one, we did Wales, and we did our man, and we did Roosevelt. So how many was that? 1, 2, 5. That's not bad. That could be a lot worse, for example. So let's have a look at the last few questions and have a look. Let's see. Capture One is so much better than Lightroom. Woo! Thanks, Laura. Are there any similar alternatives to Photoshop? The one that's growing fast seems to be Affinity Photo. So have a look at that. I'm not experienced enough in using it to know its comparison. I think for me, Affinity Photo would look great because I don't do a whole bunch of clever Photoshop stuff. So if you need to do blemish control, basic retouching, curves, all the other stuff, Affinity would work super nice, I'm sure. There's also Pixelmator, I believe, which I haven't used for a long time. I know that was quite popular at a time, but I think Affinity has picked up from that. Let's see. Uwe says, I saw bad quality after using structure control when I output to an HD TV screen, but looks good on a higher resolution monitor. I would say in your HD TV, it's doing additional sharpening. One of my pet hates with big TVs is that they always put way too much extra sharpening on it because it looks good in the showroom potentially, but generally looks awful for anything else. So I'd have a look on your HD TV and see what it's doing, but that's what I would say. Nicola, yes, there is a gradient or filter tool, or radial tool. So it's a different way of drawing a mask. So you can make a layer and then draw a linear mask or a radial as well. And they're editable once you've drawn it. So for example, if we wanted to put one here, do a new layer, get our radial gradient mask and then start drawing. Outer line is 100, middle is 50, inner is 0, and then we can obviously change the size of it by dragging the handles, change the feathering by dragging the edge, and we can rotate by hovering over the middle line, for example. And if you press M on your keyboard, you'll see the radial that it's made, and when you hover the mouse in the middle, then those lines pop up again, and it's pretty much the same operation with the gradient. Then you can use any tool on that radial. So if we did exposure, it would obviously darken that. If we did saturation, it would take the saturation out, and so on. So it's a super versatile tool. So the vignette slider just does that basic vignette. The radial you can shape to any shape you want. If I'm using styles, Tammy says, do I start at the beginning or the end? In the middle. So I'd say fix crop, exposure, white balance, those kind of environmental things. Stick on the style and then you can perfect after that. So kind of 30% in, I would guess. Jason, I'm very interested to learn how to edit lots of images at once. For example, if you shot a big job and need many images that need the same corrections. I would say go back to a previous webinar, probably. I'm trying to think if the session workflow one had one in there. But we've definitely done webinars where we talk about copy pasting and so on, but it's probably actually a really good subject, like efficient batch workflow. So that's good inspiration for me to do something in the future. But in terms of copy pasting and doing batch work, then yes, it's entirely possible, but probably just something to look in the back catalogue of webinars as well, which are all on our Learning Hub. When do we anticipate support of Catalina? Well, Catalina's not out yet. Obviously, we try to anticipate it as quick as possible. Apple, unfortunately, between releasing the Golden Master to us and the actual public release, often there's a difference again and it screws everything up. But obviously, we're trying to be as quick as possible. I would strongly urge you not to run a beta version of Catalina. There's plenty of other crazy people who want to do that, so let them do the testing and you keep your stability, I would say. Simon recommends Affinity Photo. Great, that's good. And I think that's pretty much all of our questions wrapped up, I would say. How do I balance sharpening and noise reduction? I saw Claudia was asking. To be honest, with noise reduction on modern cameras, the default that Capture One applies tends to be pretty good. It's very rare I actually go into noise reduction and change it, to be honest. My older Panasonic camera, I sometimes have to boost it, but newer Sony and Fujifilm cameras I've been using, the default is good. Don't forget, these defaults are tailored to your camera already. So even though it always says 50-50-50, under the hood there's some custom stuff going on that is designed for your camera. So don't feel you necessarily have to look to noise reduction and change it. It's already been part done for you. Can I work with Hasselblad RAW pictures? No, it's not supported currently. And also, Claudia, that's a good question. How much sharpening still looks good when printing it? What you can do in a process recipe, you can actually add, where are we? Adjustment, sharpening. You can add sharpening for print. So the way to visualize that, if you zoom to 100% and pick on output sharpening for print, and then you have to put in your viewing distance. So let's say it was a portfolio print and I was viewing it at 40 centimeters. What Capture One's going to do, it's going to look at your output scaling and resolution and your viewing distance, and as soon as we click on the proof button, the spectacles up here, then Capture One will resize and sharpen it to how it will look printed. Now generally on screen it will probably look over sharp, but once again, in my own experience, if you can cope with it looking a bit too sharp on screen, it's going to look amazing on print. But the settings here that Capture One calculates by default does a pretty good job, but you can always test. So if you know you're going to print to A3 or 10x8 or 20x30, send a test print off and see what you think. But I found the defaults for a good sharp image worked well. If the image was maybe borderline good, then I would be tempted to drop the amount down a little bit. I think the default is what is the default? I've got a feeling it's around 80, but I've messed with the defaults. So if you think that's too much, just back it off 10 points and so. But I think the defaults work really nicely. All right, I think that's kept you for long enough because we've overrun by a rather healthy amount. So apologies for that. Couple of things. The recording will go up probably sometime today, later on in the afternoon. You'll get an email when the recording is up, so you don't even have to think about it. All of our webinars are always put on learn.captureone.com. So I'm just going to put that in the chat window. And when I say all the webinars are there, that's also for upcoming webinars as well. So you can always see what's coming up in September and October on the Learning Hub as well. So learn.captureone.com. Everything is always there. Upcoming recordings, tutorials, guides, webinars, the whole lot. So thanks again for your time today, and hope to see you all again in the future. Have a great weekend and see you all soon. Take care now. Bye.